So to kick this off, what I wanted to do was, since Michael Moore is our keynote speaker for this conference, I thought it made sense to leverage some of his ideas to provide a little bit of a framework. In 1989, he wrote a paper, and then it was part of his text, with his book with Kearsley later, suggesting that there were different types of interactions that needed to exist in order to have an effective, in this case, online learning environment, right? And he talked about these three types: learner-content interaction, so learners having the interaction with some sort of material or media that's been prepared; learner-expert interaction, so making sure that the learners have the opportunity to be in contact, interacting with experts, whether it's an instructor or another expert from the field somehow; and then learner-learner interaction, having learners be able to interact with each other as they go about the learning process. And I'm going to suggest a fourth one that we add on there, and I'll add that in just a minute. But I'm going to suggest that we also consider learner context interactions and keeping the learners interacting with their environment around them. But for now, if we look at those three types of interactions that he now presented quite a long time ago, it's interesting to think about what we have actually done, right? And if you look at mobile learning as it's being delivered, and even online learning, what you tend to see is that one of these ends up being much heavier in the design than the other two. And so one of the activities that I do often, and we don't have any sort of polling devices here, so we'll have to just kind of do it hypothetically, is ask the question, think about in your mind, in your the mobile learning that you have developed, and in this case, since many of you are just starting the process, think even about your online learning experiences that you have developed at your schools. What percentage of the learning experience is learner content interaction? What percentage is learner expert interaction? And what percentage is learner-learner interaction? So think about that. Make a pie chart in your mind, a hypothetical pie chart. And what I can do is I can share with you sort of the typical response to that. Typically, when I ask that question, the response looks something like this. Typically, the vast majority of the learning experience that we deliver on mobile devices and online as well is learner content interaction. Taking text or video or animation. Sometimes it's really complex. We saw a demo just yesterday here of some media that was just beautiful, nice interactive media. But it's still learner content interaction, okay? And then a very small amount of learner expert interaction, and usually that's in the form of some discussion board or something like that. And almost no learner-learner interaction, a very small amount. And the piece of that that's a little bit disconcerting, and why I want to really take a moment before I suggest some ways to go about developing mobile learning to maybe throw out a caution to everybody who's thinking about it, is that the two that have the smallest piece of this pie are the social elements. And that's an important piece to recognize because there are loads of research that suggests that effective learning really happens in a social context. There's a great article by John Seeley Brown, and I know this is probably a little bit hard to read, but I'll make this available, where he talks about this idea of the social interactions that we have for learning actually around the content being more important than the content itself. And he cites Dr. Dick Light's research from Harvard, and he talks about some studies that he did looking at students and what made for an effective experience, right? He looked at what made a student, and I believe these were mostly freshmen, what made their experience most effective. And what he found was, even more than the effectiveness of the teacher and of all kinds of other aspects, right? It was the opportunity that students had to interact with each other about the content. Whether that was in part of informal social groups that they formed on their own outside of class, or whether it was part of the actual design of the course, that was the piece that made the biggest difference for making it an effective experience for the students. So when we think about developing mobile learning, I think it's very important that we keep in mind as we look at these different types of interactions that these two, the learner-expert and the learner-learner interactions, are the social interactions. And we need to be very careful that we keep a nice balance there as we're developing these experiences. So what I want to see if we can agree on before I move on and talk a little bit more about this is that mobile learning should not be equal to a portable CBT viewer. It can be easy to push content that we have available. We already have a whole bunch of HTML pages. We already have a whole bunch of animations. We already have a whole bunch of activities that are content-based, and just to push that out to a mobile device. You know, scrape out some of the flash, compress some of the graphics, and push it out to a smaller screen. And I think that's going to get us into a not very good place. And especially if you're just considering moving into mobile learning, it's a really good time to look at that and be consistently asking yourself that question. Do I have a good balance between the types of interactions? Any questions or comments or pushback at this point before I move on? Yeah? To be clear, I'm not advocating for not having content. Right? We've absolutely got to have content, because you don't have much to interact around if there's no content. What the catch is keeping that in balance. And where that comes is with good design, with good instructional design, and making sure that there's a thought for how much content is presented and when content is necessary. I think one of the things that we do a lot in online learning is we just give an answer instead of allowing students to come to the answer, you know, providing some information and then allow them to sort of synthesize that and present an answer on their own. So I think you need content, absolutely, but keeping it in balance with the other types of